Welcome to Hubs and Drivers, a podcast for building product marketers sponsored by BLD Marketing. I'm Dave Sladack, president of BLD Marketing, and your host for this episode. Our focus today, planning for chaos, crisis management for building materials manufacturers. A member of your senior leadership team does something to embarrass the company. There's an accident at one of your facilities and people are hurt. Or one of your products fails to perform the way it should. Each of these scenarios presents a crisis for your organization. How prepared are you? With us today is Jeff Donaldson, our Senior Vice President of Content Marketing and Public Relations. Jeff, how are you today?
Very good. It's good to be here.
Great. Well, usually I'm in your seat and you're over here hosting, but we've switched it around today. So let's talk a little bit about crisis management, okay? In your years, and you've got a lot of experience doing these sort of things, what are some of the common missteps that brands make in the building category when it comes to crises?
I've had the good fortune in many ways to be on either side of a crisis because years and years ago I was a reporter. So there were times when I had to go cover a crisis for a company. I remember working in a newsroom where we were standing outside after the newscast and we heard and saw an explosion at a manufacturing facility a mile away. And we ended up rushing to the scene and spending hours covering. And then of course, in the past 20 plus years, I've been on this side of the reporter's notebook working with clients and employers to manage crises. But the key is, it's something that you said a few moments ago. Planning needs to occur in the quiet times because once you're in the crisis, you are in it. And what tends to happen with a lot of companies is they're in the day-to-day. They're busy building the business and selling and innovating and developing new products, and they think to themselves, well, I don't need to be worried about that. Is a crisis going to happen? Do we really need to be concerned about that? There was a line in advertising years ago. Insurance is just a piece of paper until something happens. But here's my thing. A crisis management plan is just a piece of paper until something happens. Sure. And then when it happens, you need it. You need it so that you have a guide. So companies have a tendency, organizations of all types, small and large, don't necessarily want to invest the time and resources into building a crisis management or crisis response plan. And then when a crisis breaks out, they find themselves to be vulnerable because then they're in the moment. And passions and energy are running at such a high level when you're in the crisis that sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to stay grounded because you become reactionary and you're concerned about the future of the company. If you have a plan in place, then you have a guidepost, you have a roadmap, a blueprint to manage the crisis. And if you don't, companies have a tendency to respond poorly, and then one crisis creates another one. Yeah. That can really be a challenge.
For sure, and you've done crisis training for some of our building materials clients. What are the steps typically?
Well, we have to start with developing that plan. And the first thing that we preach to clients is that you have to designate a team. When a crisis breaks out, you can't figure out who's on first, what's on second. You need to determine beforehand what those roles are. Who's going to lead the team? Who's the individual within the organization that's going to lead the team? Who's the person that's going to be the administrator, the keeper of the record, making sure that all the records are being managed in some way? Who's going to be your spokesperson, or the person that's out in front, whether it's with your constituents, your clients, your prospects, the media, whomever it is, all those audiences that you have to communicate with. So it's first to designate that team. And we even recommend that you identify what we like to call understudies. Let's say, as the president of the organization, you're suddenly out of the country for whatever reason, or you're out of pocket because you've got a family crisis of some kind. You need to make sure there's somebody that's ready to step in and fill that role in many ways. We also say another key step at the beginning is to confirm the response infrastructure. Now, the great fortune these days is we have the technology to collaborate no matter where we are, whether it's Teams or Zoom or whatever platform there is. But there's still a value in having the key members of an organization in one place, particularly when a crisis breaks out. So that means you identify what that crisis response location is. Is it your offices? Is it perhaps because you want to avoid the offices for whatever reason, depending upon the crisis? Are you concerned there are going to be protests outside your organization? Do you need to move that location somewhere else? What is that secondary location? That's not something you want to be working out when the crisis breaks out. You want to have that firmed up and in place. And then Third, you want to ensure that you have all of those outside consultants lined up and ready to go and have their contact information. When you're dealing with a crisis, that's an insurance company. It could be a PR firm like some of the services that we offer as a full service agency. Is it an attorney or a lawyer that needs to be involved as well? Is there a legal aspect to this crisis that you need to think through? So it's really about getting all of those resources in place and ensuring they're ready to go. And then we say, game it out first. Don't go into a crisis without already thinking through certain crises you may end up dealing with as an organization. You mentioned at the top, and these are our clients. Building materials manufacturers are manufacturers, so that means they are making something.
Sure.
And there are possibilities that there could be injury. What if there's a fire in the plant? What if somebody is injured in the plant? What if one of your leaders is caught up in some sort of corporate reputation crisis? We always recommend, and we work through this with clients, we recommend gaming out some of those scenarios and literally spelling out the separate steps that you need to take to manage that specific type of crisis, the steps that you need to take so that you're not starting from scratch when you're in the moment. And we believe the best way to do that is to have something you pull off the shelf, metaphorically or physically, pull it off the shelf when the crisis occurs so you have a guide in some ways.
So preparation is the key. What about some of the best practices that you've seen?
Yeah, it's a matter of staying agile, but being smart and methodical, but also being action-oriented. In some cases, those sound like they're opposed in some way, but it's important to be both. You want to be agile. You want to make sure that you're making decisions in a timely fashion, but you also have to be deliberative in the process of managing a crisis. First and foremost, you got to gather details. Information is critical and it's key, and you got to focus on the facts. Emotions are going to be running high when a crisis breaks out, because you're tied into the future of that company and the success of that company. And when something like this is happening and you feel like it's uncontrollable in many ways, that has a tendency to get people's emotions running high. So you want to focus on the facts and make sure you're gathering them. And you want to manage expectations across the team. People are going to get frustrated because suddenly they're seeing something on social media, or are there protests outside the plant, or there's a rumor that this is happening. You've got to get everybody to, in some sense, try to temper their reactions, focus on the facts, and think a number of steps ahead. And this is what I'm talking about when it means being agile, but also being deliberative. Make sure you're getting varied perspectives across the team. You want everybody to be weighing in, to feel like they have been given the opportunity to take ownership of what's going on, but you need somebody to make those decisions in a methodical and smart way. So it's being thoughtful, but being decisive. And it's about making informed and timely decisions. The key with the crisis is it can change very quickly, and one crisis can lead to another. What I like to say is, you want to think 3 steps ahead when it comes to crisis. If you look at a metaphor to describe it, it's instead of playing checkers where it's jumping one piece, it's looking at the whole board and playing chess. What can happen if I do this? What if that person does that? What does that mean? You really have to game it out and think thoroughly and carefully through the whole board, looking at the whole board, so that you're anticipating questions and, determining what kind of potential new developments there might be. And crafting communications, not only that start with core messaging and the facts, but making sure that those communications cascade carefully to all the audiences that you're dealing with. Because when you're dealing with a crisis, you're dealing with your own employees.
Sure.
You're potentially dealing with the media. You're dealing with
many
your customers, your prospects, the general public. It all depends on, are you dealing with emergency response personnel? Are you suddenly dealing with local leaders who've taken interest in what happened? I dealt with a crisis that ended up on the floor of Congress and ended up being something that was debated or discussed in Congress, and there was potentially a congressional investigation into what our client was doing. Now, it ended up that they were able to survive the crisis, but you don't know how quickly something can escalate.
Sure.
You got to look at the whole board and make sure you're thinking about all the constituencies in many ways.
Interesting. A recent study published in The Economist looked at 8 most notable corporate crises since 2010, and the studies were very interesting. While the companies survived, they were on average worth 30% less today than they would have been in comparison with their peers. So the bottom line, the more prepared you are for a crisis, the more your building materials brand can weather it. Thanks for joining us on Hubs and Drivers. Until next time.